Have you ever wondered if consciousness could be immortal? What if death isn't the end but merely a transition, just a shift in the form of awareness? Philosophers, scientists, and spiritual thinkers have grappled with this question for centuries. Many argue that death signifies the end of our consciousness, plunging us into an eternal nothingness. But what if this view is wrong? What if our awareness, far from vanishing, persists beyond our physical existence in a way we cannot yet comprehend? In today's exploration, we delve into Thomas Clarke's philosophical argument, challenging the widely accepted idea of death as the ultimate void. He proposes a radically different view, one that aligns deeply with certain Buddhist teachings. Consciousness is not only continuous but potentially immortal. Could this perspective change the way we see life and death forever? Let's take a deep dive into the positive nothingness fallacy and examine how Buddhist philosophy speaks to the immortality of consciousness, offering a perspective that transcends the traditional understanding of the self and the afterlife. The error of positive nothingness and Clarke's argument. The debate surrounding death and the afterlife is not a new one. Throughout human history, philosophers, theologians, and even modern secular thinkers have pondered the concept of mortality and what, if anything, comes after. One prominent argument that has emerged in recent philosophical discussions is put forward by philosopher Thomas Clarke. His stance challenges the traditional view that death is the end of all experience, and more specifically, the idea that death equals a positive nothingness. Clarke critiques a widely held belief, especially among secular thinkers, that upon death, individuals are cast into an eternal void. This void is thought to be an absolute, unchanging nothingness, an endless state where consciousness ceases to exist. While this view may provide some comfort to those who struggle with the fear of the unknown, Clarke argues that it is a logical fallacy. To him, death is not the entrance into some dark, eternal chasm of nothingness, but rather a transition from one form of existence to another. The very concept of nothingness is problematic. Secular thinkers who subscribe to this view often treat death as if it is a positive, tangible event, a state that can be defined as a nothing. This idea suggests that when we die, we are not simply ceasing to exist. Instead, we are experiencing a kind of void, a positive nothing into which we fall. Clarke rejects this notion outright, emphasizing that such an interpretation of death leads us down a misguided path. Drawing from ancient philosophy, particularly the views of Greek philosopher Epicurus, Clarke underscores the fallacy of assuming that death is synonymous with non-existence. Epicurus, in his work Letter to Menocius, famously stated, "Death is nothing to us. When we exist, death is not, and when death exists, we are not." Clarke highlights this statement because it directly challenges the fallacious notion of positive nothingness. According to Epicurus, the experience of death is not something we can comprehend because, once we die, we no longer exist to experience it. The crucial point Clarke makes here is that death is not a state of nothingness. He argues that we, as conscious beings, cannot experience a void, simply because consciousness is not something that can be extinguished in the way a physical object can. Consciousness, Clarke contends, is a continuous, unbroken stream of awareness that cannot simply cease to be when death occurs. Rather than being plunged into oblivion, we remain conscious, but the form of that consciousness may change. Clarke's argument challenges the concept that death is an event that ends all experience. It raises the question of whether our understanding of nothingness is deeply flawed. Rather than seeing death as a final endpoint where consciousness is forever extinguished, Clarke's argument proposes that death should be understood not as the cessation of existence, but as a transition from one state of awareness to another, perhaps in a different form or in a different context. Personal subjective continuity and consciousness as immortal. At the heart of Clarke's argument lies the concept of personal subjective continuity, a crucial idea in his defense of the immortality of consciousness. Personal subjective continuity refers to the uninterrupted flow of awareness that each individual experiences throughout their life. This stream of consciousness is continuous, even in moments when we are not consciously aware, such as when we sleep or are under anesthesia. Even during these unconscious states, we remain at a fundamental level connected to a continuous flow of awareness. Think about it this way. When we fall asleep, we lose all awareness of the passing time. We don't remember the specific moment we drifted off to sleep, and yet we wake up in the morning with the unbroken experience of being ourselves, of continuing the same stream of consciousness we had the previous day. This personal continuity of awareness is what Clarke argues forms the core of our consciousness. It does not require specific memories or particular sensory inputs to persist. It is an ongoing experience that we carry with us through time. Clarke suggests that this same principle of continuity can apply after death. Just as we have no memory of the time before our birth, we should not expect to experience a gap or a void following our death. Our consciousness, Clarke argues, will not vanish, and we will not be cast into a nothingness. Instead, our continuity of consciousness will simply manifest in a new form, potentially outside the bounds of our current understanding of life and identity. This argument for immortality of consciousness is grounded in the idea that we are fundamentally awareness, not just the physical body or the collection of experiences we identify with. While our body and mind may transform or perish, the essence of who we are, our subjective awareness, remains intact. To better understand this idea, we can think about some of the world's most influential thinkers and public figures, such as Albert Einstein or Nelson Mandela, whose contributions transcended their physical bodies. Although both men have passed, their ideas, philosophies, and the effects of their actions continue to influence the world. Their legacies live on, not in the physical sense, but in the lasting impression their consciousness made on the world. Clarke's argument suggests something similar for all individuals. Our consciousness may not cease upon death, but may continue to exist in ways that transcend the physical body. This philosophical stance aligns with the belief that consciousness is not tied to any particular vessel, the body, but is a continuous force that can persist beyond the death of the physical form. The example of life pause and its implications. To further illustrate his point, Clarke introduces the thought experiment of life pause, a hypothetical procedure that temporarily halts a person's consciousness while allowing for extensive physical and mental modifications. In this scenario, a person's mind is frozen in time, while advanced technologies are used to alter their memories, personality, and even physical appearance. In this experiment, Alex, a man who feels disillusioned with his life, decides to undergo life pause. After the procedure, Alex emerges as a new person, either as a refined version of himself or as a completely transformed individual, a different personality, different memories, and different preferences. Despite these radical changes, Alex's subjective experience remains uninterrupted. He does not experience any break in his continuity of awareness. From his perspective, the process feels like a seamless continuation of his consciousness. Even more striking is the second possible scenario where Alex Reborn emerges from life pause as a completely different person. Yet Alex still feels as if he has always existed in the same continuous flow of awareness. His subjective experience of life does not perceive any gap or interruption. This scenario mirrors the transition from life to death, as Clarke argues. Even though there are drastic changes, there is no real interruption in the continuity of subjective experience. This raises the philosophical possibility that, even after death, consciousness may persist in some form, whether or not it is tied to the same individual identity. The key point is that the continuity of awareness does not cease. It simply shifts or transforms. The nature of consciousness and reincarnation. This discussion brings us to an important question. Is the continuity of consciousness something akin to reincarnation? Many people, especially in spiritual traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism, view reincarnation as the process through which a soul or consciousness moves from one life to another. However, Clarke's argument diverges from the traditional view of reincarnation. He does not suggest that consciousness retains its individual identity after death. Rather, he proposes that consciousness itself is a generic subjectivity that is not bound to any particular individual. Instead of viewing death as the reincarnation of a specific soul, Clarke's model suggests that consciousness transcends individuality altogether. It is not a matter of your consciousness moving into a new body or form. Instead, consciousness itself, as a universal phenomenon, simply continues without interruption. We are all consciousness, and that consciousness will persist across time in whatever form it takes. Thought experiment. The case of life pause. The thought experiment proposed by philosopher Thomas Clarke, centered around the hypothetical procedure, life pause, plays a critical role in his argument for the immortality of consciousness. In this scenario, life pause is a technological procedure that temporarily halts an individual's consciousness for a period of time, allowing the individual's mind and body to undergo various modifications. This idea forces us to consider a challenging and insightful question. Even after undergoing such profound changes, whether in personality, memory, or physical form, would the individual still experience a continuous, uninterrupted stream of consciousness? At first glance, the notion of life pause might seem fantastical, reminiscent of sci-fi tales that explore the limits of technology. But the implications of this thought experiment are grounded in a deeper philosophical investigation into the nature of consciousness itself and how it relates to personal identity. In the first, less radical scenario, an individual undergoes only mild modifications, perhaps some slight changes in personality, preferences, or behavioral tendencies. These are not deep changes, but rather subtle alterations in the way the person interacts with the world or perceives certain experiences. From the perspective of the individual, this experience feels like a seamless continuation of their life. There is no perceived break in consciousness. The individual may feel slightly different, but the continuity of their subjective experience, the feeling of being the same person, living the same life, remains intact. In the second, more radical scenario, the modifications go far beyond minor adjustments. Here, the individual undergoes significant transformations. Perhaps their memories are altered, their personality undergoes a complete overhaul, and even their physical appearance changes drastically. In a way, they may emerge as a different person altogether, someone who appears physically and mentally distinct from the original individual. Yet, despite these radical changes, Clarke argues that the continuity of consciousness remains unbroken. Even though this version of the individual, now Alex reborn, has experienced profound changes, it feels like a continuation of the same stream of awareness to them. Alex, in this case, may not remember his previous identity, may not recognize his former preferences, and may not even appear the same to others, but his subjective experience, his consciousness, remains consistent throughout the transformation. What is the significance of this scenario? The key takeaway here is that consciousness, the subjective experience of being aware, persists despite radical changes in the body and mind. Whether you undergo a small change in preferences or a drastic transformation in identity, the continuous thread of awareness remains intact. This has profound implications for our understanding of personal identity and the immortality of consciousness. The notion that consciousness remains unbroken despite changes challenges traditional materialistic views, which often treat the mind as something entirely tied to the physical state of the brain. In contrast, Clarke's argument suggests that consciousness is not so fragile. It is not a product of any specific moment in time, or any particular body or set of memories. Instead, consciousness is an ongoing, continuous phenomenon that transcends the individual instances in which it manifests. Immortality of consciousness, a transition, not an end. To further solidify the argument that consciousness persists beyond radical change, Clarke extends the life pause scenario into the realm of death. What happens then when the body experiences something irreversible like death? For instance, imagine the individual, now Alex, who was undergoing the life pause procedure, but instead of this temporary halt, he tragically dies in a car accident on the way to the clinic. What happens to the consciousness? According to Clarke's reasoning, death is not an end to consciousness. Instead, a new form of consciousness arises in the universe. This new consciousness, which we can refer to as Alex renewed, is completely independent of the original identity. It has no direct causal link to the individual who passed away, and yet it shares the same fundamental nature of awareness that Alex possessed. It is not a continuation of Alex as a personal identity, but it is still, at its core, the same stream of consciousness, continuing onward in a new form. Clarke's argument here is simple yet profound. Consciousness transcends individual identity and survives the death of the body. It does not disappear. Instead, consciousness continues. It takes on a new form, but it is the same essential awareness that continues to experience the world. The key here is that the continuity of consciousness is not interrupted by death, just as it wasn't interrupted by the life pause procedure in the thought experiment. This challenge to the conventional idea of death as the end of consciousness has remarkable consequences. In traditional religious and spiritual views, death is often seen as the final end, the permanent cessation of personal identity and awareness. However, Clarke presents a radical shift in thinking. Death is simply another transition, not a termination. This shift is particularly important when we consider it from a Buddhist perspective. In Buddhism, the cycle of samsara, the cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth, does not involve the transmigration of a permanent, unchanging soul. Instead, what is reborn is consciousness itself, which is perpetually remanifested according to karmic conditions. The continuity of consciousness in Buddhism is not about reincarnation in the traditional sense. It's about the ongoing cycle of awareness and experience, where the self is not permanent but constantly shifting and changing. Clarke's argument aligns with these Buddhist principles in a fascinating way. Consciousness, from this perspective, is not tied to any single individual identity. Just as Buddhism teaches that we are not our bodies, our identities, or our memories, Clarke's argument reinforces this idea. Consciousness is impersonal, boundless, and eternal. For instance, Nelson Mandela, one of the most powerful leaders in modern history, continues to be a source of inspiration long after his death. His consciousness, his legacy, persists in the collective memory of humanity. While Mandela's individual body and personality are no longer with us, his consciousness, as experienced through his actions, thoughts, and influence on others, continues to impact the world. This idea that consciousness can transcend the individual and remain part of the greater flow of existence aligns well with Clarke's assertion that consciousness is not limited by the physical body. Likewise, figures like Albert Einstein, whose revolutionary ideas changed the way we understand the universe, still influence scientific and philosophical thought today, long after his death. While Einstein's physical body is no longer present, his ideas and consciousness continue to shape the world. Consciousness as universal and impersonal. One of the more profound insights in Clarke's argument is that the continuity of consciousness is not bound by personal identity. In the traditional view, we might assume that consciousness is always tied to an individual, the self that experiences the world. However, Clarke's argument suggests that consciousness is impersonal. It is not owned by any one person or being. Instead, it is a universal phenomenon that exists wherever there is awareness. This perspective challenges our deeply ingrained notions of individuality and personal identity. The concept of open individualism, proposed by philosopher Daniel Kahneman, supports this view. Open individualism asserts that there is only one subject of experience, and that subject is everyone and everything. Every conscious being, from the smallest insect to the most complex human, is experiencing the world through the same stream of awareness. In this view, there is no separate self. The you that is reading these words is the same you that will experience the next moment of consciousness. Whether you experience that moment as an individual with a name and identity or as a universal subject, it is ultimately the same stream of awareness that transcends the body and the individual. The insight here is that consciousness is universal, and death does not mark the end of this universal experience. Death, instead, is just another transition. Just as moving from sleep to wakefulness does not end our continuity of experience, moving from one life to the next does not sever the continuity of consciousness. The ethical implications of universal consciousness. The final and most profound implication of Clarke's argument is its ethical dimensions. If we accept that consciousness is universal and continuous, then we are called to rethink our ethical responsibilities. Since we share this universal consciousness, the suffering of one is the suffering of all. Our actions, whether in love, kindness, or harm, affect the entire fabric of existence. This realization brings us face to face with the interconnectedness of all beings. Consider how human rights activists like Martin Luther King Jr. or Mahatma Gandhi have had a profound and lasting impact on the world. Their work did not merely change the lives of those they directly interacted with. It altered the collective consciousness of humanity. Their legacies show that our actions can have an enduring effect on the shared consciousness of humanity. Just as they were deeply connected to others during their lives, their consciousness continues to influence people around the world even after their deaths. By recognizing that consciousness is not individual but universal, we are called to see all beings as part of a larger, interconnected whole. This view carries ethical weight. It suggests that we must strive to reduce suffering wherever we can, knowing that the pain of one is the pain of all. This perspective challenges traditional views of retribution and selfishness, calling us instead to work towards collective well-being and compassion. Buddhist perspective on consciousness and immortality. The concept of immortal consciousness within Buddhist philosophy offers a profound challenge to conventional views of death and the afterlife, inviting us to reconsider the nature of existence itself. Buddhism does not speak of an eternal soul that transcends multiple lifetimes, but rather of a continuing stream of consciousness that perpetuates itself through cycles of samsara, the never-ending cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. This view aligns closely with the modern philosophical discussion about the immortality of consciousness, highlighting a continuity that exists beyond the physical body. Buddhism emphasizes the impermanence, anicca, of all things. Everything in existence is subject to change and transformation. Impermanence is a core teaching, reflecting the understanding that everything we experience, including our own bodies, minds, and identities, is not fixed but constantly in flux. This impermanent nature of the world can be unsettling, but it also provides the foundation for a deeper realization about the nature of consciousness. Consciousness in Buddhism is not tied to a permanent, unchanging soul, but is seen as a transitory, yet enduring flow. This distinction is crucial, for it suggests that the essence of who we are is not anchored in a static, indivisible entity that continues unaltered across lifetimes. Instead, what persists across lives and cycles is consciousness itself, a fluid, ever-changing experience that adapts and transforms. Buddhism's view of consciousness stands in stark contrast to many Western ideas of the soul. For instance, in Judeo-Christian thought, the soul is often viewed as an eternal, unchanging entity that exists beyond the physical world. In contrast, Buddhism teaches that the self is an illusion, a construct of constantly shifting experiences and perceptions. The idea of a permanent, unchanging self is an illusion we create through identification with our thoughts, feelings, and experiences. In reality, the self is just a temporary manifestation of the continuous flow of consciousness, subject to the laws of impermanence. This perspective aligns with the modern philosophical notion that consciousness itself is not tied to any specific identity, but rather to an ongoing, ever-changing stream. Buddhist teachings and contemporary philosophical perspectives both challenge the notion that our identity is a fixed, unalterable entity. Instead, they propose that consciousness is the primary, enduring reality, and that what we call self is just an illusory construct that arises in response to this continuous stream of awareness. Consciousness as an ever-shifting stream. In the Buddhist worldview, consciousness is not static. It flows and changes, perpetuating itself through the cycles of life and death. This view of consciousness closely parallels the streaming consciousness concept found in modern psychology and philosophy, where consciousness is understood not as a single, fixed entity, but as a continuous process of awareness, constantly changing with every passing moment. The teaching of impermanence, anicca, suggests that nothing in the world, whether it is physical, mental, or emotional, lasts forever. The human body, for instance, is subject to aging, sickness, and ultimately death. Our thoughts, feelings, and even our personal identity evolve constantly. However, within this perpetual flux, consciousness itself remains as the unbroken thread that connects our experiences. It is like a river flowing through time, constantly changing its form and its contents but never ceasing to flow. To put this into a modern context, we can draw a comparison with famous figures such as Steve Jobs or Barack Obama. Jobs' innovations in technology continue to influence the world, even though he has passed away. Similarly, Obama's legacy persists through the ongoing societal shifts he inspired. Their consciousness, or the imprint they left on the world, continues through their contributions, ideas, and actions. Their physical selves may have passed, but the consciousness that shaped their influence persists, demonstrating the immortal nature of consciousness. Buddhism's impermanence doctrine allows us to reflect on the transitory nature of our individual identities, encouraging a view of self that is not bound by any fixed or eternal essence. Just as the body and mind change, so does consciousness, but this change does not equate to an end. The continuity of consciousness suggests that even after death, there is no true end to awareness. Consciousness continues, potentially manifesting in new forms, adapting to new experiences, and perpetuating through the universe's flow. The illusory nature of the self. At the heart of Buddhist teachings lies the concept that the self is an illusion. The self, or ego, is a construction we build through our interactions with the world, our perceptions of our identity, and the labels we place on our experiences. However, this sense of self is not inherent or permanent. It is a temporary manifestation, and it is subject to change. For instance, global icons like Nelson Mandela or Mahatma Gandhi might be seen as the embodiment of justice, peace, and human rights. However, both of these figures were not defined by any single moment in time, but by their lifetime of experiences, actions, and transformations. In the Buddhist sense, their self was an illusion, shaped by the context and choices of their lives. Even their immense influence and enduring legacies are part of the transitory flow of consciousness, representing the changing but unbroken stream of awareness. This idea aligns with the Buddhist concept of anatman, which asserts that there is no permanent, unchanging self. Instead, we are a confluence of experiences, memories, and perceptions that change and transform with each moment. The ego is nothing more than a series of mental and physical phenomena that arise and pass away, and this understanding allows us to recognize that we are not bound by any single identity or any fixed idea of self. As Buddha famously said, "We are what we think." Our thoughts shape our sense of self, but this self is always in flux, ever-changing in response to external and internal stimuli. In Buddhist thought, the realization that there is no permanent self can be liberating. It frees us from the illusion of control and allows us to experience life with greater openness and awareness. By letting go of our attachment to a fixed self, we can embrace the impermanence of existence and find peace in the knowledge that consciousness is not confined to any single form or identity. Ethical implications, the responsibility of immortal consciousness. The realization that consciousness is universal, impersonal, and continuous holds profound ethical implications. If we accept that we are ultimately consciousness itself, then we must also acknowledge that all conscious beings are interconnected. The boundaries between self and other begin to blur, as we come to understand that our experiences are part of a shared, continuous flow of awareness. This interconnectedness calls for a deep ethical responsibility, a responsibility to care for others, to reduce suffering, and to cultivate compassion and kindness. If consciousness is not confined to any single individual, but is shared across all beings, then the joy and suffering we experience are intimately linked to the experiences of others. This realization compels us to act in ways that promote well-being and alleviate suffering for all beings, not just those who are closest to us. In Buddhism, this principle is embodied in the practices of metta, loving kindness, and karuna, compassion. These practices are not merely about feeling sympathy for others. They are about actively seeking to reduce suffering and increase happiness for all sentient beings. Understanding that we are all part of the same flow of consciousness leads to a deep ethical awakening, one that transcends the ego and focuses on the collective well-being. To illustrate this with a real-world example, consider the actions of figures like Malala Yousafzai, who advocates for girls' education worldwide despite facing personal danger. Malala's life work transcends her personal identity and embodies the compassionate vision that Buddhism encourages. Her actions affect millions of girls, giving them the chance to learn and lead fulfilling lives. Her efforts to alleviate suffering go beyond her immediate self, showing how compassion and universal consciousness can guide us to act for the benefit of all beings. Similarly, figures like Bill and Melinda Gates have dedicated much of their lives and resources to global health initiatives, seeking to improve the lives of the most vulnerable around the world. Through their philanthropy, they demonstrate a commitment to reducing suffering and increasing happiness for those beyond their personal sphere, embodying the Buddhist principle of acting for the greater good. The practical implications of the ethical responsibility of consciousness. As we reflect on the continuity of consciousness and its ethical implications, it becomes clear that these teachings are not just abstract philosophical concepts, but can be practically applied to daily life. Understanding that consciousness is universal and interconnected encourages us to act with awareness, to see the world through a lens of compassion and understanding. This shifts our focus from selfish desires and personal gain to the well-being of all sentient beings. For example, if we view environmental issues through the lens of interconnected consciousness, we begin to see that the suffering caused by climate change is not just the problem of one country or one community, but of the entire world. The loss of biodiversity, rising sea levels, and the destruction of ecosystems affect us all, as we are all part of the same web of life. Therefore, the ethical responsibility to care for the planet becomes clear. In the same way, understanding that our actions have far-reaching consequences allows us to engage in more mindful, compassionate behaviors in our everyday lives. Whether it's through small acts of kindness toward others, making environmentally conscious choices, or working to alleviate societal injustices, the realization that we are all interconnected leads to a profound shift in how we live and interact with the world. As we've seen, the idea that consciousness is immortal holds profound implications, both philosophically and ethically. Thomas Clark's argument challenges the conventional view of death as an end and invites us to reconsider how we understand our existence. This view is strikingly similar to Buddhist teachings on impermanence and the illusory nature of the self, where consciousness is not bound by a fixed identity or physical form, but instead flows and shifts, perpetuating itself through cycles of life and death. By recognizing the immortality of consciousness, we are faced with an ethical responsibility to live with compassion and kindness, knowing that we are all interconnected through this universal flow of awareness. The realization that we share in the same consciousness calls us to transcend the ego and act for the well-being of all beings, reducing suffering and fostering happiness wherever possible. In the end, the continuity of consciousness isn't just a philosophical concept. It is a call to action, a call to live with mindfulness, to embrace impermanence, and to care for all living beings, knowing that the thread of awareness connects us all. Let us reflect on this knowledge and allow it to guide our actions, fostering a more compassionate, interconnected world. What are your thoughts on the immortality of consciousness? Do you believe that our awareness persists beyond death, or is it all just an illusion? Share your thoughts with us in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more insights on the nature of consciousness and the teachings of Buddhism.